So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our workshop. My name is Manuela Schlömmer, and I am Communications and Language Officer in the European Commission in Berlin. In times of digitalization, the topic of data and data literacy becomes increasingly important. Today, we talk about data literacy in its translation-specific form of professional machine translation literacy. For this, our workshop partner, TH Köln, provides learning resources for teaching relevant components to bachelor and master students in translation and specialized communication programs. We will start with a theoretical output, including several presentations, before we continue with the practical part, where TH Köln will guide you through an example of the learning resources. And please note that this workshop is recorded and that you will receive the slides and the link to the recording 1 or 2 weeks after the workshop via email. And please keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation, and please don't use any offensive language nor political comments. If you have any questions during the presentations, please drop them in the chat. We will collect them and take as many as possible. During lunch break, you will have the opportunity to have one-to-one meetings with other participants. If you go to the participants page, you can send them a meeting request. And in the end, we will have free voluntary networking sessions, which you can also still add to your agenda if you go to the events website. And the topics are DGT and eTranslation, TH Köln and the DataLit MT project, and the European Masters in Translation. Now I would like to hand over to Professor Dr. Ralf Krüger from TH Köln and the leader of the DataLit MT project. And afterwards, our Commission Director, Jörgen Gren, will welcome you to this workshop officially, and we are very much looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela. Hello and welcome everybody to this Translating Europe workshop on teaching data literacy in the context of machine translation literacy. My name is Ralf Krüger. I'm a professor of language and translation technology at the Institute of Translation and Multilingual Communication at TH Köln, University of Applied Sciences in Cologne, Germany. I'd also like to welcome the DataLit MT team members who are here today, Janissa Hackenbuchner, André Busch and Monja Janet. And I would briefly like to explain the rationale behind this workshop and behind the research project which report upon in this workshop. For a long time, the translation industry and other professional sectors have seen accelerating processes of digitalization and datafication. In a translation context, digitalization comes in the form of the permanent development or evolution of translation technologies, terminology management systems, translation memory systems, etc. And more recently is being accelerated by powerful new artificial intelligence algorithms in the field of natural language processing. You've seen convolutional neural networks, recurrent neural networks, and most recently, the transformer algorithm, which is also the basis of ChatGPT and the other GPT models. Datafication occurs through accumulating large volumes of translation data, again, terminology databases, translation memories, mono or multilingual text corpora, and some of these resources can also be used for training translation-specific NLP applications, such as neural machine translation systems. So NMT as a data-driven machine translation paradigm combines these two processes of digitalization and datafication, and they can accelerate each other through this combination. This has led to a considerable increase in translation automation, mostly through the integration of NMT systems in translation production workflows in recent years. And accordingly, an adequate degree of machine translation literacy, or we call it, with a view to professional translators, we call it professional machine translation literacy, is becoming more and more relevant for professional translators. Parallel to the increasing relevance of MT literacy, both for professional and for layperson users of this technology, an adequate data literacy is also becoming more and more important, again, both at the level of specific professional fields, but also at the overall level of modern datafied societies. In various professional sectors, management and production processes have become increasingly datafied in recent years. So data literacy is more and more seen as a key prerequisite for enabling people to navigate the complexity of modern data ecosystems. I quote here from MISRA 2021. Now, our project starts from the premise that although data literacy education is becoming more and more relevant for students of translation and specialized communication programs as a transversal literacy, which they can then also use in their role as citizens of modern societies. There's less of a natural fit between data literacy and these study programs, which have traditionally focused more on linguistic, communicative, and intercultural aspects. Than, for example, between data literacy and more technology-focused programs such as computer science, data science, or computational linguistics. And we felt that for data literacy education in a translation or specialized translation context to be feasible, we felt that we must first establish suitable points of contact between data literacy and topics which are more central to translation and our specialized communication study programs. And Data Lit MT assumes that machine translation, modern data-driven machine translation, is well suited to serve as a conceptual bridge between data literacy on the one hand and translation and specialized communication on the other. Again, this was a brief explanation of the rationale between the Data Lit MT project. In this workshop, we'll provide an overview of the theoretical groundwork of Data Lit MT and on the learning resources that we developed as part of this project. And we also have some keynotes from external speakers who will talk about interesting topics in the context of machine translation. And with this, I pass on the floor to Jörgen.
Thank you so much, Ralph, and thank you also, Manuela, and thanks for this invitation. And thank you to the organizers of this very interesting workshop. And I'm very glad to open officially, as Manuela said, this workshop. I'm not so sure this is the official opening, but in any case, I'm happy to be here. Just to build perhaps a little bit on what Ralph has been saying. I mean, clearly AI is a hot topic. I don't think it has escaped anyone that ChatGPT has just been released, and many others, similar systems, will follow. So many things have turned or are indeed turning on their heads, and the impacts and ramifications of this new step forward, this changing gear, if you will, is becoming clearer as we speak in academia, in literature, search, knowledge gathering, even job interview preparations, but also, of course, translation and generally speaking, language services. And this will not be possible without massive computing power. But of course, what is driving these advances, the fuel, if you will, is data. So the EU, generally speaking, and the Commission as well, we all need to adapt to this new reality, but we are not starting from scratch. Data and using data to assist translation has been on the radar with us for over 2 decades. As you know, I hope you know anyway, we have over 25 years worth of professional quality aligned translation in the Euromis system. We are talking here about 1.5 billion segments currently, and this was the pioneer. And this has opened up many, many doors for us, such as the MT at EC, machine translation at the European Commission in 2013, which was our first statistical machine translation system. And then we also, as Ralph said, we have neuro machine translation some 4 or 5 years ago that started our first foray into AI. But on top of this, we also have separate gathering or language data gathering efforts, such as the European Language Resource Coordination work that we are doing with the member states to get member state language data and corpuses that we can use for our own systems in machine translation. Or another example is the EU-funded Paracrawl system, which allows us to crawl the web and find freely available web pages in multiple language versions. So we, at the European Commission, we have 3 types of data. So we have the very high quality Euramis data, we have the good quality ELRC, European Language Resource Coordination data, and we have very raw paracrawl data. From our perspective, the first two, we assume them to be accurate and actually in the language identified. Web crawl data, on the other hand, is a mess. Maybe Andreas from my team, who is here today, will go into this. I don't know, but web crawl data is, of course, a mess. It's a mess. It's not in the identified language. There are different versions in different languages. So, which means that filtering is really needed so that we don't teach our translation models with the wrong translations. In short, just to say, when it comes to data, we are working very actively with data in the Commission at many levels. I think this covers, shall we say, the technical side, but there's also the side. And I wanted to touch a little bit on this because we also have international audience here today. We also have a political side on the data. I mean, the most well-known one, I think, across the world even, is the General Data Protection Regulation. This is something which is well known, and this is about the use of personal data and the safe use of personal data and how we deal with data as organizations or as enterprises when we gather data. But there's also something more. We have recently the AI Act for promoting the safe and lawful uptake of AI, which is also being discussed right now in the Council and the Parliament. So we, on the legislative side, on the political side, we are moving forward quite substantially in the European Union and even showing the way, I think, when it comes to ethical use of data and when it comes to good and safe use of personal data. But we also have on the side, of course, the data promotion side. Here we have something which is called the Open Data Directive, which is also followed up by the Open Data Portal. I'll come back to that very briefly. But we also have something which is called the Reuse of Public Information Directive. This reuse of public information obliges the member states to put on the market or on the Open Data Portal or openly data to be used and reused, such as business registered data, for instance. We are now discussing internally in the Commission how we can do the same thing with the member states for language data. So this is something which is coming in the context of reuse of public information. So this is something which is coming. On top of this, we have, as I said, the Open Data Portal. You can find a huge amount of data on the Open Data Portal. We have also put partly Euramis data in this context as well. So you can see that, again, on different levels, both operationally, technically, but also politically, we are very much working with data, trying to make available, trying to ensure that the European Union is also coming into the data field in the best possible manner. And we've done this now for the past 10 years, 10, 15 years, actually. So it's not super new, but some of these things are quite new, like the AI Act, for instance. So in short, for us, and I only had 4 or 5 minutes, so we'll end with this, just to say, in short, data is really essential for Europe, and we are moving forward on many, many fronts. And I think this has a bearing, and this is why I wanted to introduce it like this. This is a bearing on your discussions here today, where you will combine both the theory and the practice on how you teach data literacy. And I end with this. I think data literacy, as Ralph said as well, is truly an important, maybe even an essential competence today for language professionals and for translators. But I wish you an excellent workshop. And again, thanks to Ralph, thanks to Manuela in particular, for having organized all of this. And I think this will be very interesting. Looking forward to listening in and to understand a little bit better about these different issues from your perspective. Thanks so much. All the best for today.
Thank you very much, Jörgen, for your presentation and your welcome address. So we continue with our theoretical part now.
I would like to present the eTranslation system from here in the European Commission, but also talk a little bit what we do beyond. And my name is Andreas Eisele. I have been in this project and its precursor project, MTRTC, since 2010. Now, what is eTranslation? It's an online neural machine translation tool provided by the European Commission, and officially it was launched in 2017, but as I will say in a minute, it has some precursor and there were activities towards this starting in 2010. It has been developed by DG Translation, where we are, Manuela and I, and DG Connect, who normally funds research projects at academic places and also companies throughout Europe, but also has helped us to increase the machine translation activities via this Connection Europe facility and now the Digital Europe program, which gave us big opportunities to grow and improve what we already had. So it is based on this earlier MTEC project, which was still statistical and somewhat hybrid machine translation, started in 2010. And this project itself replaced earlier rule-based machine translation, which actually the Commission was very early to use. So first activities in this area started in the 70s and led to a system with yet another acronym, ECMT, I think. And this was being used until 2010 with quite some success, but only for Western European languages, so Portuguese, French, English, and so on. And it was very actively used already, but it turned out to be too difficult and also too expensive to extend a rule-based solution to all these new languages that became relevant when in this big accession wave of 2004. So there was a decision before this MTRDC project started to actually phase out rule-based MT and try something new, which gradually became accessible. And I may mention that before I joined the Commission in 2010, I had been working as a researcher in various places, also on machine translation and also for a couple of years on statistical MT. So for me, it was kind of a continuum going from basic research to applied research to big scale application as we do it now. And the project is developed and run by a team of computational linguists and software engineers here in Luxembourg. So who can use it? It's aimed at a number of user communities, including translators who use it as a tool to provide drafts, which they can then improve, but also other EU staff in all the EU institutions who can use it to gain quick access to documents they cannot read and which would otherwise need human translation, which is slower and more expensive. But even MT@EC was already aimed at public administrations in the member states, so ministries in all member countries could already use what we had then. But now with this new setting in this Connecting Europe facility or Digital Europe framework, it has been open to even more users in small and mid-sized enterprises, or EU freelance translators can get access. Universities can use it, or non-government organizations. So it has gained a quite broad user base now. And different use cases require different, say, ways of tuning the service to the needs of the users. So now, how can you use it? As individual user, you can use it as part of your translator's toolbox or just via the eTranslation website. But another important use case is also to integrate it into IT applications and websites throughout the various institutions. So for the individual use, you could register through this page, and in order to be able to do it, you will need to have an EU login, which you can also get via this link. And once you have this set up, you can go to the website. And one way of using it is just to translate snippets of text in the now well-known way, where you enter text in one window, you click some buttons, and you get, after a while, a translation in the other window. And we support currently 32 languages, but the number may grow. So there might be, or so we will soon have better support for the smaller Norwegian language. We already do Bokmål, but we will do more for Nynorsk on specific requests from there. But we also have, beyond the EU languages and the languages of the European, the extended EU, we have some big world languages like Arabic, Chinese, Russian, and last year we added Ukrainian for sad reasons, but we were quite quick in doing it. So you can select the source language. If the text is long enough, it will can also be determined automatically. You can select the target language, and you will get the translation. You can use it to translate documents, and we support quite a number of different input formats, like typical Office documents, but also PDF with some loss in accuracy because it has to be turned into text first, which may at times be confusing for the algorithms. You can enter multiple documents in one go. You can also request multiple target languages in one go. You can select for the target format the same as the input, except for PDF. In this case, you would get Word format. But you can also request the result to be in XML, in TMX or XLIF format. So if you have a translator toolkit, this will be what's most convenient for you. And you can and should also select an appropriate domain. So initially we built these engines for the EU formal language, where we use the data from this Euramis project Jörgen mentioned, the huge centralized repository of all the translations translators have done in the institutions, very high quality data. So this was a wonderful starting point to build the project on. But then later it turned out that sometimes this data is not optimally suited for translation of other text, like newspaper text or whatever. Like in the case, if you translate a word like chair, then in the EU formal language model, you may get something like the president of some body, Vorsitzender or whatever. But chair might be a piece of furniture. So it is important to understand that we have a number of alternatives here. So we have the general text engines, which have been built on much larger data sets beyond Euramis. But as Jörgen already mentioned, more data is also a bigger challenge because the additional data is not as clean, as high quality. So we invest a lot of effort in filtering the data before we build the models, but there's always cases where results aren't perfect. I mean, that's generally the case for MT, as you definitely know. So these are the two big domains, the EU formal language, the general text engines, but then we also have quite a number of more specific domains, which mostly are based on smaller data sets. So there's more legal text in the engines for the Court of Justice, case law. There's engines, a set of engines for the for the financial domain, where we received data from the ECB and also from national banks before we built that one. And they may be better suited for particular text, but in the more general cases, one of the first two will be the better. And yeah, so this has already been said. We built on 1.5 billion segments from the Euramis database, and this is constantly growing. So we have lots of new sentences every day, which is wonderful. And there has been a very strong focus on making the environment secure. So it's okay to use it for personal, for say, documents you do not want to share, but it's not okay to use it for classified documents. So if it's something really secret, then we cannot guarantee to 100% that no one may steal something. So the data you send through the system is deleted very quickly, and it is never shared with third parties. Depending on your use case, you can also arrange for the results being deleted immediately after you download them. And you should avoid email, because sending the results via email is inherently insecure. So you do not need to do it, and you can avoid it. We have better alternatives. So you retain full ownership of your data. And as I already said, results are never perfect. So I have two very simple examples where you can see that. Here, the price of failure is too high has been translated as ein Scheitern können wir uns nicht leisten, which is a somewhat free, liberal translation, which may be very good in a certain context. But if you use the same segment in a different context, like you talk about activities of someone else, then this können wir uns leisten would not be correct. But currently, all our engines translate sentences one by one, ignoring context. So that is clearly a drawback where we are working very hard to overcome it. But currently, context beyond the sentence is not taken into account. So this may not be the translation you want. Also, there's a small detail. The final dot has been translated or has been replaced by an ellipsis marker, which is wrong, but it's a detail, can tolerate it. This next one is also, I mean, in some cases good enough, but it's wrong. Energy is the lifeblood of our society, has been translated as Energie ist der Lebenssaft unserer Wirtschaft. So that's economy. So that's not correct. And errors like that will be happening if you use the system. If you use systems of other providers, they will happen as well. There's no machine translation that is that can avoid this kind of errors completely. So you have to be careful, and either if the result is supposed to be published, it has to be manually checked very carefully by humans who understand also the fact that these translations are very fluent, so the errors may be hidden quite well. It may require extra effort to find them, but they are there. But if you use it just for inbound translation to understand a document you cannot read in its language, then you have to be aware that the results may contain also severe errors where negations are dropped, or a country name is replaced by something else, a different country, or even something completely unrelated. So it is always a risk to use machine translation, but I think you are mostly translators, you know that. So I would like to mention that it has been integrated in websites and IT applications throughout the portfolio offered by the Commission and other institutions. So there are multilingual websites, also including high-profile content. And the general strategy is to provide human translations for certain languages where we know that lots of users will read it in their language. But in cases when the Commission cannot afford to manually translate a page into all the 24 EU languages, there may be at cases as a stopgap machine translation provided, but in these cases it is clearly marked and visible, so people who look at these pages should understand that this may contain errors. I would like to show you the trend in the use of the system. So it started with 20 million pages per year in the first year, then it grew very quickly. And 2 years ago, we had a record where our various engines translated overall more than 200 million pages in 1 year. Last year, it went back a little bit. I don't want to go into reasons why this happens, but it's just that the number 2 years ago was a little bit inflated by users who had large volumes of old text they wanted to send through. But the trend is clearly it's growing. So we hope that 200 million pages per year is the normal volume we will have to process. Also, you can compare what we do against what human translators in the DGT do. They translate, or in the Commission, they translate like 2.5 million pages per year. And within the same target audience, we translate significantly more with our system. But I mean, it's not translation, it's machine translation. So it's not really comparable. We have a breakdown in from which the service is used, and it's a bit uneven. We do not fully understand why Austria almost provided half of the 20 million pages in this case, but this is definitely just a snapshot, and it will change over time. And last not least, we have not only worked on machine translation, but also on additional natural language processing services. So there is one version of machine translation called multilingual tweet, which is aimed at translating text as it appears in Twitter and social networks. But we also work on new functionalities such as speech to text or classification or other things. So there's a page which gives access to all the services we currently offer. So speech to text is possible for 27 languages, and again supports quite a number of different input formats. And we also do anonymization, so you can send a text through one of our systems, and then you can have dates and names and things that shouldn't appear in an anonymized version. You can either replace it by random replacements, like different names, or you can also obfuscate it and have it grayed out. So this is useful in certain contexts, but it's not meant to be a service to be used in large scale, because in a way, if the text is sensitive, it's a little bit against the spirit of anonymization to send it through a remote service for anonymizing it. So the idea is more that this is a showcase of what can be done, and if you have needs for that, then we should think about a more, say, tailored solution. So that's already the end of what I wanted to say. I must say I lost track of the time, so there might be questions or time for questions. Anyhow, there's a advisory team who will help to answer questions and help in difficulties. So there's all the links on these slides. So my colleagues will handle your requests. And these are all the links I mentioned so far. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for your presentation and the insight into eTranslation. And we still have 10 minutes time for questions. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat or also unmute yourself if you want. We have enough time for that.
So while there aren't questions, I can just...
Sorry. Could I?
There are.
Could I ask a question? Andreas,
Sure.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Because it's such a pressing topic, I mean, the large language models we see now, ChatGPT, GPT-4, etc. There's also already been some work on how they could be employed in a practical translation context. There was a pros.com seminar, which I found very interesting, where somebody showed how if the interface is there between the model and the translation production system, like Trados or whatever you're using, that they could be used to standardize or to harmonize terminology, to fix or to edit fuzzy matches coming from a translation memory. Again, provided the interface is there. You could also think of new voice applications, like saying, "Hey, ChatGPT, could you change this term to another term?" So once you can interact by voice with these systems. Are there any preliminary plans at DGT of including some of these functions in future translation production workflows?
Thank you. That's a very good question, very hot topic. And indeed, several of my colleagues are working on these questions. So we recently had a internal review session where we have kind of a strand of our activities where people in the team read scientific papers and present it to the rest of the team, so that we try to stay as close to the state of the art in research, while we cannot do basic research ourselves. And we are watching this very carefully. And as I mentioned, this colleague has presented various ways how ChatGPT and friends have been used to improve machine translation. And we also explore how we could have access. So I should perhaps have mentioned that all the services we are running in a cloud. So these are not servers provided by the Commission itself, but in this case, a cloud provided by Microsoft. But they have a framework contract where they guarantee that the data will never leave Europe. But given that Microsoft is very close to ChatGPT, they also provide usage of ChatGPT as a service, which we will explore as soon as we have the access. We have applied for it, and there will be soon ways for us to explore this. And this is indeed something we cannot ignore. Like 7 years ago, there was the big paradigm shift from statistics to neural, and we were quite proactive in experimenting, even at a time when we did not yet have cloud access. So this was some miracle that happened. And we were actually the first ones to have in big institutions who had a neural machine translation into Hungarian. And the same colleagues who then did this kind of proactive efforts are now exploring the ChatGPT. There's also an activity run by a colleague of mine who is exploring more general applications of AI. So he's kind of collecting a big community of users within DGT, but also other parts of the Commission, who then collectively brainstorm and think about additional functionalities that would be good to have. So amongst the services we are developing, there's summarization, but you can easily imagine once summarization is up and running, which will be soon, you can imagine to have the inverse thing where you just give a short summary and artificial intelligence provides a longer text, which then of course has to be manually reviewed because it will contain wrong facts and all that. So we are quite active, but it's also always a question of costs because running servers is expensive. So actually our systems are not the best systems we could build. We have taken part in kind of contests, shared tasks organized by the research community, where we have explored how far can we go to build even better systems. And it is possible, but it comes at such a high cost that we cannot translate 200 million pages per year with that effort, like for engines running in an ensemble combo, and then finding a fusion of the results into something that's even better than each individual hypothesis. So there's a lot of things we can do in theory, but not currently in practice. So you will have to give us some time to not only explore what we can do to increase quality. I mean, taking context into account or incorporating, as you said, fuzzy matches. These are extremely promising features. But you also have to give us some time to find out what is a reasonable, say, compromise between what's theoretically possible and what can be done in real life practice.
Okay, thanks. Very interesting.
Thank you very much. We have another question in the chat from Alina. Thank you, Andreas, for the interesting presentation. My question concerns the Ukrainian language in eTranslation. Since it's not an official EU language yet, where do the training data come from? Is data quality and quantity good enough for neural machine translation?
Thank you. Very good question. So when we built the general text engines, we already used a lot of non-EU translations to feed into the training data. And in several cases, it's much more than we have internally. But as Jörgen already said, and I also repeated earlier, that this additional data is more, but it's also less clean and less high quality. So we have worked very, very much on improving our tools, or also use tools from the research projects funded by the EU to collect data not only from the web, but also filter it and find the best subset. And from this pool of additional data, we have taken also data to train the Ukrainian engines, but we have also specifically crawled translation from websites provided by the Ukrainian government, where they partly translated EU law into Ukrainian, just as a very proactive effort to prepare a potential accession. So there were, and also Ukrainian laws have been translated by parts of the Ukrainian government into English, and these texts have been available on servers of the Ukrainian government, and we crawled them and used them to say make the training data we use for our Ukrainian engine a bit more give it a better coverage of more formal types of text. So it is maybe on average less high quality data, but it's still very good, and we have made the best we could to filter it. So it's definitely much better than not having Ukrainian at all. But as I said, generally, I mean, machine translation can contain errors. You always have to check manually and avoid taking risks.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have another question from Gabriella. I was wondering if it would be possible to use eTranslation with CAT tools such as Trados Studio.
Yes, this is possible, and this is one of the most of the earliest use case. Even before we started eTranslation, MT@EC was aiming at helping our translators, our colleagues who do translation, to use our drafts with their CAT tools. So you can request TMX or XLIF files, and you can load them into Studio or whatever CAT tool you are using that supports them, these files. What you cannot do currently is using eTranslation on the fly while you work with the CAT tool, because that would introduce waiting time. So if you, while working in your CAT tool, request a translation from eTranslation and it takes 5 seconds to come back, that's kind of that time where you cannot really continue. So this is a use case we have not supported yet, and which would be expensive to do, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm afraid we will have to stop here with your presentation as we are running out of time. Thank you very much, Andreas.
There will be the breakout session in the
Yes.
afternoon. So all the other questions, if you join us in this breakout session, then we can discuss much more.
Yes, so if you still want to join the network session then in the end, please add it also to your agenda. Thank you very much, Andreas. And
Thank you.
now I will hand over directly to our next speaker, Professor Dr. Lieve Macken. She is Associate Professor at the Department of Translation, Interpreting and Communication of Ghent University. And her topic today is teaching machine translation evaluation with MATEO.
Hello, thank you, Manuela. I was just wondering, I'm not so familiar with the platform, but in the agenda I have a different link. Is it the same recording now and the same link we have to use, or do we have to switch?
Are you in the good morning session? We are in the good morning session now, so if you're still in there, it's okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. So I will also try to share my screen. Entire screen, this one. Okay, do you see my full screen now?
Yes, we do, thank you.
Okay, yeah, I can't see you anymore, so but it's okay. So good morning, everyone. My name is Lieve Macken. I'm professor in translation technology at Ghent University. And the main part of what I will present today is how we introduce the topic of machine translation evaluation in a course targeting translation students. And the tool we used for that is a tool that we developed ourselves in our research team, and it's called MATEO, so that's why it's in the title. MATEO was developed within our research team. So what I present is joint work with Bram van Rooij and Arda Desjan. Bram was the developer of the tool, and we got funds for that from the EAMT, so the European Association of Machine Translation, and Clarin. It's ongoing work, so you will get some screenshots, but it's still work in progress. And we also submitted a paper for EMT in Finland. So I will give now a more lightweight presentation on this, because I think the audience is much more diverse today than it will be in EMT 2023. So you get a kind of preview what we will do in Finland. Yes, I think the whole topic of today also deals with machine translation literacy. As said before, machine translation is increasingly being used in the professional translation workflow. And within the EMT competence framework, so the framework of the European Masters in Translation, MT literacy and awareness of the possibilities of MT and limitations is one of the competences that should be covered. The term machine translation literacy has been introduced by Lynn Bowker and a colleague in the context of scholarly communication, but it has been by many others. And O'Brien and Eisenberger-Dow define it as knowing how MT works, how it can be useful in a particular context, and what the implications are of using MT for specific communicative needs. At Ghent University, we offer a 5-credit course on machine translation and post-editing. And this course, unfortunately, is not part of our normal masters because we only have a 1-year master and we have to cover too many things. But it's part of a European Master in Technology for Translation and Interpreting. And I've already seen some familiar faces of EMTTI students in the audience today, so a warm welcome to my former students. And it's also part of a postgraduate program we offer, where our students normally enroll in if they're interested in the more technological parts, which is a 1-year postgraduate program, computer-assisted language mediation. In this course, we have a theoretical part, and in this theoretical part we still think about the challenges for MT. Why is it difficult? How is it that it's more difficult for some languages than for others? We still teach the different approaches to MT. So we start by really reflecting how rule-based machine translation worked, because this is what at least linguists are more familiar with, and they're most easy to get. But it's very important, I think, to start thinking about the challenges and make the link with rule-based machine translation. We still start with SMT because their language models are introduced, and we take this then as a first step to neural machine translation. And then, of course, a large part is devoted to machine translation evaluation, I think, which is especially important for translation students. Then we also have a hands-on part, and there we use MAT and MT and MATEO, but I will explain in a minute what these are. Yeah, so the field of machine translation is really evolving in a very fast pace, and at universities, it's really challenging for lecturers to catch up with this fast evolving technology. So luckily, several initiatives have been taken to develop and to distribute publicly available teaching materials to teach MT to translation students. One very nice project, according to me, is the Multi-Train NMT Erasmus Plus project, in which an open access course book has been published in 2022 by Dorothy Kenny. And this book really targets language learners and translators. So it's convenient also for non-technical people. In this project, there was also an open source, pedagogically oriented neural machine translation platform that has been developed, and it's called MUT-NMT. And there students can go through the various stages of building an MT system, from uploading parallel corpora, training and evaluating MT systems, and inspecting translations. So it's very convenient as well. Then, of course, another initiative is DataLit MT, but I'm not going to talk about this because these are the people organizing this workshop. And then at Ghent University, we recently developed 2 things. One is an animated explainer video on NMT, and I will show it in a minute. And we also developed this tool, MATEO, which I will talk about more later. So maybe first the explainer video. It's created by members of our team and a creative agency called Epic Frame, which is located in Belgium. On the slides, you get the URL, so it's freely available on YouTube. So please do use it, because it took a long time to produce it, and it also costs a lot of money to create such a video. I'm going to show it to you because we are a very diverse audience, and the video touches upon different aspects related to MT, such as word vectors, word embeddings, the importance of context, linguistic distance, language coverage, and so on. We do have a Dutch version, which was created first, and then we made an English version as well. So if you would like to have the Dutch version, please do contact me and I'll give you the link as well. So I will try to play it. And I hope the sound works. So please do interrupt me if the sound is not working.
Hi, I'm an automatic translation system. Now, my head used to be full to bursting with vocabulary lists and grammar rules, and my progress was slow. All of those rules and exceptions gave me a headache. I couldn't translate new words, and my sentence structure wasn't always right. This caused problems. Translated messages were often misunderstood, and users became unsure about their interactions with me. But now, I use a neural network, which means I learn from lots of examples. I learn from novels and their translations, translated subtitles, multilingual websites, and so on. And I don't like to brag, but I can process more text than anyone could read in an entire lifetime. With this mass of information, my neural network can learn how to translate. And as with all computer systems, the information must first be converted into number sequences, also known as word vectors. A word vector places each word on different axes in a multidimensional space. Words that are somehow related to each other are closer together in that space than words that are unrelated. I can easily work with a space of up to 1,000 dimensions. Now try getting your head around that. All those numbers represent different aspects of meaning, which, in an abstract way, allows me to understand the meaning of words. Before I start translating, I study the whole source sentence. Because of all the information I've gathered about words, I know how they connect with each other. And this means that I make fewer and fewer grammatical mistakes. Sometimes I don't have enough information about particular words in a sentence to work out the correct meaning. When that happens, I use the most frequent translation, which is useful, but by no means foolproof. But if you give me a sentence with more context, I usually manage to provide an accurate translation. I also find it easier if two languages are similar, so I can do a better job of translating from Italian into Dutch than from, say, Chinese into English. All the information I process helps me to become the best version of myself. And the better I become, the more I can help all of you to communicate with each other as effectively as possible. But to become even better, I need a lot more information. I know about 200 languages so far, but there are almost 7,000 in the world. And on top of that, I'm not as good as I'd like to be at translating creative language. For this and other difficult tasks, I prefer to work with language professionals. Would you like to know more? Then have a look at the following website. Hi, I'm an automatic
Okay, I hope you liked it. The other tool we developed is called MATEO, and MATEO stands for Machine Translation Evaluation Online. I mentioned it before, it's developed by a colleague of mine, Bram van Rooij. And it gives you access to 6 automatic evaluation metrics. So you have the more traditional metrics that maybe you are familiar with, such as bleu and ter. These are word-based metrics. It also provides you character F scores, so it's a character-based metric. And then, of course, the more recent, more state-of-the-art metrics, which are null, so BERT score, BLERT, and COMET. We developed, or we proposed this as a project proposal and got funding because we used in the past similar platforms, and one of it was Isaiah Online in our teaching classes, but unfortunately it's not up and running anymore, and it did not include these null metrics. We do have a web interface, and here is the URL. It's still running on servers of Ghent University, but I think at a certain moment it will be transferred to servers of Clarin. And I think the web interface is most important for this audience, but of course the underlying code is also available via GitHub, and it's part of Hugging Face. There's a page where all the metrics are explained, a high-level explanation, and you can click them or you follow the links, and then you get to the research papers if you really want to know more. And this is how the interface looks like at this moment. So you can select the metrics you would like to get. So I selected all of them. You give a source sentence, you add a reference translation, which is a manual reference translation, and then you get, you input multiple MT outputs, and you're going to click on evaluate, and you get the evaluation scores. You can download it then as an Excel sheet. At this moment, we only input sentences, but Bram is working very hard so that we can upload also full texts. Yes, MT evaluation, I think it's a very important part in a course on machine translation and post-editing. And there are two types of evaluation. You, of course, have the human evaluation, and then you have the automatic evaluation metrics. The human evaluation is maybe the most straightforward task for linguists, but if you really want to do it in a production environment, it's labor intensive, it's expensive. Evaluators do not always agree. That's another way you have to be aware of that. But depending on how you set up the evaluation, it can be very informative. Automatic evaluation, on the contrary, are low cost and consistent, but they give you reproducible results. And what you basically do is compare the MT output with a manual reference translation. For human evaluation, there are different ways of doing this. You can rank translations. So if you have 3 different translations, you can ask the evaluator what's the best, what's the worst system. You can score translation, which might be already a bit more informative. And what's typically done is that you give scores on 2 different aspects. Accuracy, which means what's the amount of content and meaning that's retained in the MT output, and fluency, where you give a score on the degree to which the translation meets the standards and conventions of the target language. And you typically use 1 to 5 point scales for this. There's a much more informative way of evaluating in a human way, which is error analysis, but it's really very time consuming. And then you can use error taxonomies, and you're really going to annotate all the errors that are in the MT system. There's MQM, which is very frequently used, but at the same time that MQM was developed, we developed a SCADE error taxonomy at LT3, so it's more or less the same thing. Then for the automatic evaluation metrics, I already mentioned it's reference-based. So what you will do is you will compare the MT output with the manual reference translation. And the underlying idea is that the closer the MT output is to the reference, the better the quality is. So what it basically boils down to is that you're going to compute some kind of similarity between the MT output and the human reference. And you can do that on different ways. As I mentioned before, you have word and character-based metrics. So there you're looking at the surface form. But the newer state-of-the-art neural evaluation metrics work with these word embeddings, and that's why I showed the video. The word embeddings or word factors, it's the same thing. So the most frequently used metric still is BLEU. What it basically does is looking at overlapping 1 to 4 grams, and it's a ugly word, the 1 to 4 grams, because it basically means 1 to 4 consecutive words that overlap. So if you look at this machine translation and reference translation, you're just going to look at the sequences of consecutive words that overlap, and you compute a score on that. There is another metric, it's called translation edit rate, and this looks at the same thing from a different perspective. It's the number of edits that you require to transform the machine translation then in your reference translation. And then you are going to count the number of insertions, deletions, substitutions, and shifts where you really shift the whole block. So if you do it on our example, then you have to delete du, have to insert de la, have to delete the word mal, and have to insert the word maladie to get to our reference translation. A newer metric that also works on the surface form is character F. What you do there is you're not going to work anymore on the word level, but you're working on the character level, and it's going to calculate precision and recall on character n-grams. I'm not going to explain in detail how it works, but I give you the feeling how it works. So you also going to look which character n-grams overlap between the machine translation and the reference. So you go away from the words level, and this has some advantages, as you will see that in our example, mal and maladie, you get some characters that overlap, so you get some extra points for that. Then the newer metrics, which are maybe much more difficult to compute, are metrics that compare word embeddings, so these word factors that were explained in the video, and you're going to compare the word embeddings. You're going to work on a much more abstract level to compare the machine translation and the reference translation. So you really have to think again on how words are represented in NMT and in these newer models. So we're talking about word factors of up to 1,000 numbers. There are different metrics that were created. I only found a very nice picture of BERT score, so I'm going to show you this. So what the first thing you do is you have a sentence. For instance, the weather is cold today, and you have a machine translation. For instance, it's freezing today, and you're going to compare this, and you're going to get all these numbers, and then you're going to compare how much they agree. So it's on a much more abstract level. BERT score and BLERT, they are both in fact metrics that were created for text generation. So they only look at the target. So you only look at the target, your reference translation, and your MT, and you're going to compute similarity scores then based on word embeddings retrieved from large pre-trained language models. Another one is Comet, that does more or less the same thing, but this one also takes into account the source sentence. So this is about the metrics. What did we do with then in our students project, or how did we include this in our course? There was one project the students had to work on, and the main goals was in fact twofold. They first had to critically reflect on the suitability of MT for different texts, and we gave them 3 English source texts, and they had to work with 3 different MT engines. And the second part was to critically reflect on the usefulness of automatic evaluation. And then they had to do some human evaluation and then use automatic metrics and then compare and critically reflect on that. The students, I had a very nice group this year. So I had students from a very, very diverse background, which makes it very interesting, of course, to teach machine translation. So we had 9 different target languages we could work on: Dutch, French, Brazilian, Portuguese, Romanian, Turkish, Farsi, Kazakh, Ukrainian, and Russian. And all the students either got formal translation training in a prior training program or had already worked as a translator before. To assess the suitability of MT for different texts, we selected 3 different texts from another project that differed in difficulty level and style. And all these texts students had to translate into their L1, and they first had to reflect on translation difficulty. So why is one text more difficult to translate than another? They had then the MT output of 3 MT engines, and they had to manually evaluate it. They had to do 2 tasks. They had to rank the translations, the MT suggestions from the 3 engines to best to worst, and they had to provide accuracy and fluency scores on a 5-point scale for each sentence. When you looked at perceived translation difficulty across students, so we selected texts from which we knew that sorry, there was a message here. So we selected texts with different difficulty level, and we only found moderate agreement among students. So there are many individual factors, such as interest in the topic, background knowledge, translation experience, that were frequently mentioned as factors determining translation difficulty, apart from real text-specific characteristics. So it's very difficult to say this text is difficult for all translators, and for all languages. But the text-specific difficulties that the students commented on were terminology, idiomatic expressions, proper names, word order, and complex sentences. When we compared the perceived difficulty and the TMT quality, this did not always align. So what makes us assume that translation students and machine translation systems face different problems during translation, which is a good thing, because then the machine translation can sometimes help. And the main factors that are important are style and content of the source text. So one text was the text on love sickness was very informal, also contained a lot of figurative content. It's very challenging for MT, but the students liked it very much to translate. And then there was a more objective text, but it contained long and some complex sentences, a lot of factual information that had to be checked, which was more challenging for the translation students, but the machine translation did a good job there. The second part of the project dealt with the usefulness of the automatic evaluation. So I already mentioned that all these automatic evaluation metrics are reference-based. So you're going to compare to one kind of reference. And the students had to use 2 references. So the first one was their own translation, but we also provided them with a professional translation to see what the differences are. Students then had to reflect upon the agreement or disagreement of their manual assessments with the automatic obtained scores. Several students pointed out that character F worked better for their target language than the word-based metrics bleu and ter, because especially for highly inflected languages, because it works on the character level, which makes it more suitable for highly inflected languages such as Russian, Kazakh, and Turkish. When you looked at text averages and you compare top, middle, and bottom rankings, most students found that the more traditional and the neural metrics fit this criterion, so you get more or less the same ranking, but the neural metrics were perceived to be more comparable, except for Kazakh, but there probably there was not enough data to train the neural metrics properly. Students attributed the better agreement to the ability, of course, of the neural metrics to capture semantic similarities between the MT output and the reference translation. So synonyms, paraphrases, they all have similar word embeddings. So they make these neural metrics less reliant on exact matches and word choice for human evaluation. So these were the comments we got from the students, but of course they always worked on one language pair. We took then all the data together and we calculated some correlations. And we looked at the ranks of the MT systems and compared it with the ranks from the separate scores then as assigned by the systems. And what we saw is that the blurred rankings correlated best with human rankings. So if we looked at all data together, this was what we got. And character F was the better metric within the word and character-based metrics. When we looked at the different references, the obtained scores were always higher when translators were used as reference translations, because the students tended to stay more close to the source texts and the professional translators deviated more. I have a short example to show for English-French. So you have your source sentence, you have your student translation and your professional translation, and you will see that the student stays more close to the source sentence and the professional translation. And this, of course, it has a huge impact on the obtained scores. So I think as a key message or a take-home message, it's very important that you are aware about the reference translation, also how it has been created, if you're going to use it to create automatic scores. So as a wrap-up, I presented how we taught machine translation evaluation to our translation students. We started from 3 English source texts with varying difficulty. They had to translate it into their L1. They had to reflect upon translation difficulty, and then had to assess whether MT is useful or not. Then they had to assess MT quality using manual and automatic evaluation metrics. And we used 2 different reference translations, the students and the professional reference translations, and you had to reflect upon obtained results. Many of the comments that the students made were afterwards confirmed in the cross-lingual analysis. I only showed you one analysis we did. We did many more analyses, but this will be presented at our paper that we will present at AMT 2023. We will make the source text and the professional translations also publicly available. So if you want to redo the same exercise later in your own course, please feel free to use it. Have a look at lt3@ughent.be because the link will be provided there. So I'm very open for questions. I stop sharing my screen so that I can see the audience again.
Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation, Lieve. I'm already looking forward to hearing more about it at EMT. I'm taking over here just for the moderation part. Manuela Schlömmer will be back for the practical sessions in the afternoon. we cannot run too much over time. So maybe if there's, I mean, we've already posted 1 or 2 questions in the chat, but I could reach out about that later on. So I don't know if anyone else has an urgent question that they would like to ask.
Maybe I can quickly comment on the question of Ralph.
Of course, yeah.
So the whole point of MATEO is that all these dependencies of the difficulty of implementing it, it's that it has been taken care of. So if you look at at GitHub of Hugging Face, where MATEO is there, it should be straightforward to have it up and running. So.
That's good to hear. It can be a pain if
yes,
you have to re-implement it. Yeah, it can be a hassle. Thanks.
Yeah, and the Comet models and the updates. To be sure, I'm not sure. But Bram is taking care of the updates, so I think he's always having the latest version that's available.
Yes, I can imagine. Very useful. Thank you so much for responding to that. I can see there's no questions at the moment, which is also great timing because we have another presentation to head towards anyways. So thank you so much again, Lieve, for presenting MATEO.
Okay, my pleasure.
All right, so we will just remain in this session for this last presentation. And then afterwards, we will switch sessions in the agenda on your B2Match platform. So just for now, we can remain here. And I am happy to introduce our last speaker before our little break, Dr. Danielle Saunders, who will talk about difficult inputs for machine translation. She's a research scientist at RWS working on machine translation. So you're very welcome to start, Danielle.
Great. Can I be heard, first of all?
Yes.
That's a good start. You get to see my infinite slides.
Yes,
my infinite thing. Okay. At this point, I cannot see anything except my slides, so hopefully you can see my slides.
At the moment, it's still black.
Ah, that's great. Okay. Wait a second. I think I know what the issue is, hopefully. Is that any better?
No, still black.
Okay, so. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
This is the dangers of having multiple screens, which they don't tell you. Is that any better?
Yes, now we can see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you for your patience and thank you for inviting me, of course, and everyone who's stuck around to listen. So as you can see, I'm going to talk about a pretty broad topic today, which is difficult inputs for machine translation. This is not the same kind of thing as what machine translation systems are bad at. Probably everyone knows that machine translation systems can be bad at lots of things depending on the exact system and the data that's used to train them. What I'm going to talk about today is some different types of input that are often the cause of problems for systems because they are somehow not suitable for the assumptions made by the technology. And some of those have standard fixes that are widely applied, and you may find them confusing to see because you don't see them as problems in systems, because everyone already handles them. Some of the problems are open research areas, which are very much not handled. But I've chosen the problems I'll talk about today because they're important to be aware of for developers who obviously want to fix the problems, and end users who are just using MT in their daily lives. You know, we've seen mentioned previously today that very fluent MT systems, if you don't speak the language, you can miss the fact that they're making maybe subtle errors. So this will also not be an exhaustive list of difficult inputs. I don't think that's possible, but the examples I've selected are those which interact with different aspects of the technology. And I'm hoping to give some starting points to think about not just what are the difficult inputs in MT, but maybe more importantly, why are they difficult? What is the interaction between the input and the technology which makes these difficult, and what can we do about that? I'm also going to say now I'm not trying to victimize any specific MT system here. There will be those that have addressed these problems and those that haven't, but I will be talking in general terms, not about specific system outputs. The first type of input I want to talk about is very long inputs. By long, I would say 100 words plus. This example is not a real input, but it is, believe it or not, very similar to some things I have seen in the past. And if you look carefully, there are in fact no sentence breaks here. There's a lot of things that look like they could be sentence breaks, but there's no end of sentence. So if no mitigating approach is tried here, what you often see, well, you can see a few different kinds of mistakes here. You might see that the model starts to output the same word many times. You might see it caught in a loop where it outputs kind of a short phrase many times, or it might simply cut off. And it might not be obvious where it's cut off, especially with a long input like this. You might just lose some of the translation. So why is this? MT systems usually have a fixed length architecture. This is somewhat exaggerated, this diagram, but there are a certain number of input units that the input sentence can be read into effectively. Beyond that length, the model has no way to process the inputs. So that is part one of the problem. Part two of the problem is that this maximum input length also applies during training. The model is just not exposed to extremely long inputs. So if it has to output some translation of a long input, it will just default to what it knows, which may be a very common phrase or one word that it's very confident about. So you might be thinking, this has never been a problem that I've seen. That's because there is a very straightforward solution, which is to split up the input. And this is what is generally done commercially. Past a certain length, the input is split up into what is treated as sentences. Those are translated, then they are rejoined. But even this very simple approach has its pitfalls. So consider, for example, a long list. Where do you split? There is no end of sentence here. If you split it in several pieces, will each part really be treated right? Even if you break at a fairly sensible point in, say, an input sentence, consider a language like German, where there might be some crucial context at the end of the sentence, which is then not available for the first half of the sentence. Or even something as simple as you might split on something that looks like the end of a sentence, but is not, like an abbreviation which has a period after it. So even this really quite straightforward problem solution has some subtle implications. It's making some assumptions which may not always be met. Problem number two, misspelled inputs. This example on this slide it's a meme, it's a bit of an exaggeration. You would not expect a translation system input with every single word misspelled. But consider a human translator dealing with this. This would probably, if they were familiar with English, this would probably be a relatively simple thing to deal with, but not for a machine translation system. And even if you have one or two words with typos in, if the typos are unusual enough, what you might see is the word doesn't get translated, it just gets copied across to the output in misspelled form. So to understand why that happens, it helps to understand how the system actually represents the words internally. So I said that these systems have a fixed length input sentence length. They also have a fixed vocabulary size, and the vocabulary being the set of unique input tokens that the model can represent, like we heard in the last talk, that can be represented as vectors. So this vocab size is far smaller than the number of words in a language like English or German. It's usually maybe 30,000. So the usual approach is that these are not actually words, they are subwords. So you start off with a set of the characters in the language, and you iteratively merge the pairs of characters, and what you end up with is very common words are represented as vocab tokens. Very rare words are broken down into characters. So say you have a relatively common word, which would maybe be 1 or 2 subwords, but then you misspell it in some way. Suddenly what the model sees changes really dramatically. And during training, of course, only very rare words get broken up like this into a series of very short characters or a couple of characters. And very rare words are often names or loan words, which are just copied across. So the system copies the typo across as if it were a rare name or a loan word. So there's a couple of different things that we can do here. Maybe the most obvious, we can use a spell checker on the input or alert the user to a mistake. This works if you have a good spell checker for the language, which is true for English and some other languages, but not all languages. You can train on more typos. You can seed the training data with artificial typos. This is hard to do realistically, actually, and it's hard to do without corrupting the training data. After all, you don't most of the time want to translate typos. And you can try sometimes splitting up correctly spelled words so that it doesn't always, if it sees a very segmented word, the system doesn't assume it's something that has to just be copied. But these all have their pros and cons. The third problem that I'll talk about is new language, especially new specialist language. So this is an artificial example with standard made-up word. But if you think about, for example, the pandemic in 2020, as it started at the end of 2019 and 2020, suddenly a very different new set of words entered everyday vocabulary. This is not just a pandemic thing. People are constantly coming up with new words in language, but clearly this can happen. Suddenly you have to deal with a lot of new terms at once. So the question becomes, how do you translate these words? So there might be translations for these words that are determined. How to fit a completely new word like wug into a language with all of the inflections and so on. But usually the machine translation system lags behind. This is because the system has never seen these words. It's never seen the translations before. And again, like with the misspellings, the default behavior is usually to copy across to the output, like with the misspellings for similar reasons as the misspellings. And this is okay, but it's not ideal. We really, if we have a translation, we want to use the translation. So what we can do about this, if we have access to some data that has the correct translation in context, we can reproduce our system from scratch. And this works. It's very slow though, and it's very expensive. We can adapt the system onto the new data. This also works, but there are some surprising pitfalls. If you continue training an existing system, sometimes it will forget its previous abilities. So it might suddenly be able to translate wug, but it's no longer able to translate anything else. That's not great. There are ways around it. Or you can use a lexicon, a kind of dictionary which you can integrate into your system. And again, there's various ways to do that. Some of them work well, some of them work less well. And this is another open research area. The final problem I'm going to talk about is machine translation and gendered language. So when an input is referring to a person, whether a specific person or just a human entity in generic terms, if you're translating into a language with rich grammatical gender, the system might have to infer the grammatical gender to use for that person. And in English, this might mean pronouns. In German, it might be a profession noun, up to languages like Hebrew, where almost every word that is referring to a person is gendered. And getting the translation right means getting the gender right. But it turns out that MT often gets it wrong in ways that correspond to stereotypes. And this clearly is a problem. And it happens for a lot of reasons. Firstly, the data we use to train these models obviously is data that has been collected over many years and is not gender balanced. This is partly because of historical imbalances in society. If you're talking about an engineer, historically, you're probably talking about a man. But it's also very heavily because of the grammatical masculine default. So if you're saying, call a doctor, the convention is to have the masculine for doctor in a language that has inflections. So even for, stereotypically female roles like assistant or secretary, the counts in the training data actually have the masculine outweighing the feminine. What happens is that this data bias combines with the fact that a lot of inputs are ambiguous. And this is maybe a broader challenge for machine translation. We often assume there is only one correct output. In fact, sometimes the MT system is having to infer information where it has nothing solid to base it on. And gender is just one example of this. It's by far from the only one. But consider this as an example. I'm an engineer. How should a system translate that if it can only translate it one way? This actually came up in the video that was shown in the last presentation. The system will choose the most likely output, and that ends up reflecting these stereotypes. So what can we do about this? Now, I've kind of facetiously suggested adjusting all the data so it isn't biased. This, unfortunately, is not possible. There is more data used to train these systems than we could possibly leaf through manually. And adjusting it automatically has been tried, and it is very, very difficult to get right and usually ends up making the problem worse. To add to that, we can kind of by definition not really do this for forms of bias that we are not aware of. And so you end up in a catch-22 where you have to be aware of the bias to fix the bias. But you can't, but you cannot identify the bias necessarily automatically. What you can do is get maybe a smaller tractable set of data that is not representing the kind of bias that you care about, and you can make sure that is well represented during training or adapt on it. That can help for a form of bias, again, that you're aware of. If you're not aware of the bias, you might find yourself in a loop where you are having to again and again fix new problems. You can try post-editing the translations to remove bias, so spotting these reliances on stereotypes if there is actually information in the input that contradicts them. But maybe what is needed as developers or as users of machine translation is to be aware that sometimes we are forcing machine translation to create certainty out of ambiguity. And in that situation, the system will really not do the right thing. So this is where MT literacy comes into it. Sometimes we need to be aware of the limitations here. And maybe what we need if we're developing MT is a more flexible interaction with it. So I've talked about just 4 types of challenging inputs for machine translation, not because they are the only challenges for machine translation, but because they arise with interactions with different parts of the system. So we had long inputs and the fixed input length, misspelled inputs and the fixed vocab size and subwording, new terms that we haven't seen before, and considerations about what the data is, whether it's up to date, whether the data is balanced, or even, you know, the way we think about how machine translation translates, how it is creating an unambiguous output from an ambiguous input. We all know that machine translation is good at some things and bad at other things, but I think, especially from this workshop, it's important to know why some inputs are challenging. Whether the problem can just be fixed by throwing more data at it, whether the problem is something more inherent with the system design, because the design informs the kind of mistakes that we're going to make, and the design informs how we could fix them. So thank you very much for listening. I think I do have a few minutes for questions, perhaps. I will not be able to see anything because my slides are still full.
Thank you so very much for this excellent presentation, Danielle. I mean, you're happy to take away your slides if you do want to see, but we're also very happy to have them. That's up to you. There is already one question in the audience, so I'll just read this out from Celia Rico. Could you please go back to the slide? Okay, well, do keep the slides in, please.
Yeah,
On social imbalance and masculine default, and could you share the source for this data?
Yeah, I should have included it as a footer. This was a paper that I co-authored with Marcus Tommelin, and I can put the title in the chat later. I apologize for not including it on the slide. Essentially, we went through manual search. We did an automatic search with manually defined parameters through some commonly used German-English parallel training data. It was Europal, I believe. Which might explain the overrepresentation of politicians. Europal is a data set that is very frequently used to train machine translation systems. And we were looking for counts per million words in the German side for the masculine inflection and the feminine inflection of these words, but in German. Hope that clarifies, and I will put the title in the chat.
Perfect, thank you so much. If there are any other questions, you're welcome to post them in the chat. We can still stay for a few minutes. Let me see, there is a comment, or is that a question from Anna? Misspelled input is often missed by spell check because it is another correct word.
Yeah.
Just completely out of place in the given text. I often discover ST errors by looking at MT, which is literal.
Yeah, so this is obvious, like you say, it's a huge problem with speech translation because speech recognition likes to pick up what it thinks are real words, and if it mishears, if it gets the wrong word, it's still producing an incorrect word. It's still producing, a correct word, but not the correct word. So that ends up with a slightly different problem to this. The word does not tend to get subworded aggressively like this. And in that case, it really depends on how common that misspelling, or in speech translation, the misidentification is. If it's very common, sometimes the system can be robust to it. And this comes back to this idea of fixing this problem by training the system to be robust to typos, by training it on more typos. But you do end up with a different kind of, error in your taxonomy. Less likely to be copied across, more likely to cause maybe more subtle mistakes. But yes, absolutely, that is an even more challenging error, especially for spell checkers.
Perfect, thank you. We do have another question from Dragos. I'm wondering about the counts mentioned in the training data. Is it possible that secretary as masculine is related to secretary general or similar as masculine?
Yeah, possibly.
And assistant as masculine to assistant professor or similar as masculine?
Yeah.
And sorry, just one more. In other words, did you have time for the unenviable task of checking manually the results of the automatic count?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. It's a really good point. So as I mentioned before, this was Europol data. So secretary and assistant are in a political, not always, we did do some spot checking, but often they are in a political context. So we are seeing that this is situations where maybe historically or stereotypically there would be more men in the role. So there is part of that. But even with that aside, if you look at a sentence and it's not referring to a specific person, and it's not got pronouns or other explicit gender markers in it, the convention is to use the masculine. And what you can do is you can look for the sentences which are only containing these professions in them. And yes, some of them would be in the context of Secretary General, for example. But the issue is not necessarily that these words appear in, trying to think of a way to phrase this. It's not necessarily an issue in isolation if the masculine term is more common, because it will be. These imbalances are really hard to get rid of. What is an issue is, well, there's two parts of an issue. One is if you have an ambiguous input, the system has to produce either a masculine or a feminine in German, with other forms becoming more popular now, I believe. So that is a problem, given that the output will reflect stereotypes. The other problem, which has gotten maybe more attention, is that the data imbalance, even if it is appropriate in context, actually gets used even when there is an unambiguous gender marker in the input. So she is an engineer, for example. A lot of systems, commercial systems, have fixed this. Not all commercial systems have fixed this. So in some ways, it's less important what the data is doing and more important what the system is doing given the data. The data is part of it, but the problem at the end of the day, even if you give it only correct in context gendered data, you can end up with problems like this.
Thank you so very much. We also have two comments from Pilar that I'll pick on before ending this. One about the fact that they also had problems regarding long sentences in the training data for mute NMT, which is based on Joey, that the system could not process longer sentences than 500 characters. So they faced that problem as well. And two more other comments that I can leave for you to read, so that we can end this presentation here.
Sure.
But thank you so very, very much for this excellent presentation, and also for all the questions and comments in the chat. That's always nice to get a lot of feedback and questions. I'm sure we could talk about this much longer. But we do have a short break coming up now. And after this break, we will resume with the theoretical input part 2. Just hand over to Professor Ralf Krüger. And together with Andre Busch, we will talk about the theoretical grounding of the DataLit MT project.
Thanks, Janissa. You will be sharing your screen, right? So
Exactly.
I won't have this Escher effect with the infinite slides on my side.
So you can see one of mine.
Okay,
Perfect.
great.
Can you
There
see
it is.
that? Great.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, we want to talk a bit about the theoretical grounding of our data-lit MT project, also what we understand, what we mean by the terms machine translation literacy, or in our case, professional machine translation literacy, data literacy, where we established the interface between MT literacy and data literacy, how we derived a competence matrix from this interface, how the competence descriptors were developed, how this translated into our learning resources, and then we'll have a brief outlook on artificial intelligence literacy. While we were working on this project, the world has kept turning, and yeah, ChatGPT et al. And this will be the next steps that we'll consider in our research. Okay, then yeah, let's go to the first slide. Machine translation literacy, the term was coined by Bauka-Butrago-Zero in 2019. Lieve mentioned this in her presentation this morning. They were concerned with MT literacy in the scholarly community. The best and most concise definition I found to date is from O'Brien and Ernstberger-Dow from 2020. MT literacy means knowing how MT works, how it can be useful in a particular context, and what the implications are of using MT for specific communicative needs. There's a growing body of translation studies literature on MT literacy. I mentioned Bauka-Zero. Bauka 2021 is concerned with MT literacy in English as a second language and digital humanities programs. Look and Le Choguet 2022 focus on MT literacy in undergraduate programs in applied languages, etc. So different fields, not related specifically to translation, but where machine translation could be employed. And Kenny, in her book on the multi-tray NMT companion book, mentions that citizens of modern societies who use and employ machine translation in their daily lives or in their professional context outside of translation, specialized communication, they should also possess an adequate degree of machine translation literacy. And we, as we're concerned with specialized professional translation and specialized communication at our institute, we took this concept and specified it. We called this professional machine translation literacy, and we defined this as the full range of MT-related competencies that professional translators or other language professionals may require if they want to participate successfully in the various phases of the MT-assisted professional translation process. Now, this definition by itself is not very helpful. You don't get a good picture of what we actually mean by professional machine translation literacy. This is why we complemented this definition with an exhaustive professional machine translation literacy framework, which we'll show you in a second, which will give you a clearer picture of what we mean by professional MT literacy. But first, some words on data literacy. I mean, Jörgen mentioned this this morning. I also mentioned this in my introductory words. There's a high societal relevance of data literacy. Misra in 2021 said that there's an urgent need to develop data literacy at the level of citizens, organizations, and society so that we can navigate the complexity of modern data ecosystems. And you've seen, for example, in the corona pandemic, where we were bombarded with information from different actors, different levels of trustworthiness, information, or the insights on the coronavirus were changing very quickly. So this was a time where data literacy was needed at a societal level. And you could say at some points we fell short of really handling this topic in an informed and reasonable way. The literature on data literacy shows a range of definitions. They are sometimes overlapping and they often apply to different contexts. Here we present the rather context-free definition by Ridsdale et al. 2015, who say simply that data literacy concerns the ability to collect, manage, evaluate, and apply data in a critical manner, and this addition in a critical manner is very important. So data literacy is not just concerned with information technological skills, but also having a critical stance towards data, being conscious of its ethical dimension, etc. We'll come back to this later in this presentation. And this morning I said we needed a bridge between data literacy and translation specialized communication study programs, and the bridge is quite obvious, we think, because NMT, neural machine translation, forms data part of the corpus-based or the data-driven MT paradigm. So we feel that MT literacy must be integrated with data literacy. Somebody's got their mic open. Maybe you could close it. There's some background noise here. The Data Lit MT project was funded by the Ministry of Culture and Science of North Rhine-Westphalia. The funding line was called Curriculum 4.0. It ran from June 2021 to February 2023. And it developed didactic resources for teaching data literacy in its MT-specific form to students of translation studies, specialized communication programs, both at BA and MA levels, so at different levels of complexity. We have a website, we have a GitHub repository, we have a YouTube channel, we have a contact email address. Janissa, maybe you could post these in the chat, but also if you found your way to the Translating Europe workshop website, there's a link to the Data Lit MT project website, which includes links to all the other resources. So you should find it on the internet.
I'll post them. I can't post them while I'm sharing the screen because I can't see anything, but afterwards I will.
Okay, good. Right. So this is the professional MT literacy framework we developed in order to complement this rather general definition of what we mean by professional MT literacy. It consists of 5 dimensions. First, it's called technical MT literacy, then linguistic MT literacy, economic MT literacy, societal, and cognitive MT literacy. Technical MT literacy, as the name implies, is concerned with the technical basics of how neural machine translation works. We had this nice video shared by Lieve this morning. For example, the technical basics of machine translation, mostly of neural machine translation, like word embeddings or vector spaces, the algorithms underlying MT, now mostly the transformer algorithm, self-attention, and all these processes that run within this transformer algorithm. Then architecture in extensions to MT, for example, adaptive machine translation that learns from user input, interactive machine translation, which adjusts the input on the fly while you're typing, document level MT, which takes document level context into consideration, multimodal MT, which can attend to external modalities like videos or images, etc. Training pipelines, how you train MT systems. We have learning resources on that. MT domain adaptation, automatic MT quality evaluation, which Lieve again talked about when she presented the MATEO project this morning, and automatic MT quality estimation, and then the practical side of how to actually integrate MT into translation workflows or systems, like providing connectors between Trados, MemoQ, other translation tools, Phrase, and the MT system you want to use, etc. Linguistic MT literacy is the traditional side of machine translation that translators and specialized communicators were concerned with, pre-editing for machine translation in order to obtain an output where the post-editing effort will be reduced. MT post-editing, of course. MT quality expectations, meaning having a feasible view of what MT can achieve with regard to certain language combinations, domains, etc. And then also being able to communicate this to other stakeholders like clients, project managers, etc. Manual MT quality evaluation, like performing accuracy fluency assessments using the MQM error typology, etc. And then being aware of linguistic quality requirements for MT training data. This is what Danielle mentioned in the presentation this morning. Economic MT literacy is concerned with with business-oriented aspects of MT, like being able to estimate or measure effort in MT post-editing, being able to, on the basis on these insights, to calculate prices in MTPE, again, to know what productivity gains in MTP are feasible, again, for different language combinations, domains, etc. How business processes have to be set up or optimized in order to integrate MT, and what are potential business risks of MT, reputation risks, cyber risks, etc. There's a very good overview by Kanfora Ottman in Translation Spaces. I think it's in 2020. It's called Risk in Neuro-Machine Translation. Societal MT literacy is, well, the societal dimension of MT, the ethical impact of MT, the questionable practice of collecting translation memory data without asking the translators who produce these translations and then use them to train high-performing machine translation systems, which could then be used to put pressure on rates, etc. So there's this huge ethical dimension to machine translation. Related to this, the impact MT has on the perception and the role of translators in society and industry. We're all aware of this human parity or even superhuman performance discourse, which comes mostly from the MT development side, where they have some, again, questionable methodologies which show that MT may be outperforming professional human translators. Being aware of this discourse, knowing how to counter this when talking to various stakeholders. Social biases in MT, gender bias is a very important topic. We heard Danielle talk about this, etc. You can see we always have these 3 dots here, which indicates we think it's a quite extensive framework, but we do not claim that we capture all dimensions of MT, machine translation literacy in their entirety. So there's an open and dynamic framework, which could be expanded or rearranged in the future. And then finally, cognitive MT literacy, cognitive load in MTPE, how to measure this, being aware of what increases cognitive load or what could decrease cognitive load, changes in text receptive productive processes in human translation versus MTPE, and also having a meta-awareness of effects such as MT priming, meaning that you're primed by the MT output and your translation will not be as diverse as it would be without having the MT output template to work with. So being aware of this and being aware of that you have to employ strategies to counter these MT priming effects. So this is an overview of what we understand by professional machine translation literacy. Then we also developed an MT-specific data literacy framework, which was derived from different data literacy framework we found when searching through the literature. And we put these different frameworks together. In our sources below, we have the references to these frameworks we surveyed for our framework. And we put this together into a specific machine translation specific data literacy framework. We have on the left side the data context, which is a more abstract dimension, covering the notion of how you being aware of that if you have certain problems in a business, for example, that they could potentially be used by be solved by using data. What I mentioned, critical thinking, data ethics. What is the ethical dimension of working with this data? Is somebody being dispossessed if you use this data to train a certain data-driven application? And data culture, again, this awareness of you have specific business problems, you have data, previous data on your business operations, you could use this data to solve your business problems. Then we're becoming more and more concrete in our data steps. Data planning involves a data requirement analysis and analyzing which data you actually need to solve a business problem. For example, if you're doing legal translation, you want to collect legal translation data for training a domain-adapted legal MT system. Then you need a data strategy, which tells you how to satisfy your data requirements. Then you need to be aware of aspects such as data curation, protection, and you need to be able to identify or evaluate data sources. For example, Jörgen talked about the translation memory compiled by the DGT. Is this a suitable resource for training your MT system or is it not, etc. And they're also being aware of data repositories such as TAOS Data Marketplace, the Opus Corpus Collection, etc. Data collection production is the central dimension of this framework, where you're concerned with data verification, acquisition, organization management, MT training data preparation in our case, how to convert or manipulate training data, processing this data, and then data creation. So this dimension is somewhat split in the middle. Data collection refers to the training data you collect in order to train an MT system, and then data production refers to the new data you produce with this system, meaning MT output, machine translations. And it is mostly this newly produced data with your previously trained MT engine that will then be fed into the data evaluation dimension, where you analyze data, you visualize data, you verbalize data, and you interpret data. And what you do in the data and evaluation phase will then feed into the data use phase, which is the final phase of MT-specific data literacy framework, where you communicate data to external stakeholders or internal stakeholders, where you do data-driven decision-making, where you should be able to critically evaluate the decisions you took based on this data, or how effective your overall data project was, and then downstream steps such as data preservation, data sharing, reuse, etc. Again, the two sources we mentioned at the bottom of the slide, they go into much more detail of what the actual dimensions and subdimensions of this framework, what they actually mean. And then we try to establish a mapping between the two frameworks. This looks kind of messy. There are quite a lot of points of context between the dimensions, subdimensions of professional MT literacy and data literacy. For example, here you have critical thinking and data ethics on the upper left side of the data lit MT framework, and you could link this to societal MT literacy, ethical impact on perception and role of translators in society and industry, etc. And we did this in order to lay the groundwork for our competence matrix, which then informed the development of our learning resources. And the idea is that the left side, the data lit MT framework, it provides the categories and the descriptions of which data literacy competencies or sub-competencies we want to teach our students. And the right side, the professional machine translation literacy framework, will then provide the application context in which to teach these data literacy competencies. Because students will be familiar with aspects of machine translation or study programs, they will not be as familiar with aspects of data literacy. So we provide these MT-specific application contexts, which should be to some extent familiar to students. This was the basic idea of establishing this interface between data and MT literacy and deriving the competence metrics from it. I think I'll pass on to Andre. Is it you, right?
Yep, that would be me, right. Thank you. So once we had the frameworks, we needed to look at our students and their knowledge about data literacy to develop suitable and effective learning resources. And to this end, we conducted a data literacy survey among the students at our institute, which included both BA and MA students in multilingual communication, specialized translation and interpreting, as well as terminology and language technology. And at the beginning of the survey, we asked them to tell us about what they associate with the term data literacy. And this word cloud that you see here shows a representative example of their answers and free associations with the term. And you might notice the rather prominent answer, no idea. So we definitely saw a need for teaching data literacy related competencies at our institute in general, which for our team was really motivating. And if you look at other answers such as handling data, analyzing, processing, and storing data, these are all very general. And we interpreted that as hints to a rather superficial understanding of data literacy. And it is also very interesting to see that their answers really only concern aspects such as data collection and processing, as well as evaluation or analysis. And we interpreted that as they concern really the hands-on aspects of data literacy, and they mostly disregard the data context or the data planning aspects in a data project, which in our opinion is crucial. And they also do not show much awareness of the potential use of data once the data has been collected or produced. And these findings in our survey really played an important role in defining the competencies that would actually be helpful to our students in their future work once they finish at university. And I believe Yanisa can tell you a little bit more about these competencies now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, so as Ralph just mentioned, next to our framework, so the Data Lit MT Competence Framework, we created this matrix. And having matrices for learning or for studying information is also common in other fields. And we have adapted this to our field and to our context. And the way that we have divided this matrix is that we have looked at all the sections of the framework, and we have split it up into a basic level and an advanced level. So generally speaking, we were thinking of the fact, okay, basic level is kind of geared towards bachelor level students, and advanced level is kind of geared towards master level students. Of course, this really depends on what type of study it is, what type of course it is, but just to kind of provide this separation, this difference in the difficulty of our learning resources. And within these two categories, we are really focusing on the difference of what we expect students to know or to do with our learning resources. So when we're looking at the basic level category, you can see that we are focusing on words such as being able to demonstrate knowledge or being able to understand and describing knowledge or problems. Whereas in the advanced level, we're focusing on actually applying this knowledge or maybe critically analyzing a situation. So the difference here is really that at the basic level, we expect mostly sort of to be able to follow our resources, to understand kind of what is going on, and maybe to see the examples as we provide them. But then in the advanced level, we're expecting a little more detailed interaction with the learning resources already, and more detailed understanding of knowledge as well, and a more critical analysis of the resources that they are working with. So this is how we've split up for every aspect of our framework. This is how we've split up our learning resources, and that we based on this matrix. And as you can see here, for example, this is the example for data context. And then we've done the same, like I said, for all aspects. So this would be for data planning, where you really have to look at, okay, do I just understand what I need to do with the data, or can I actually do it myself? Can I actually go look for data myself based on information provided? Can I follow these steps and then go and collect my own data? Or can I just click through an example that is given and understand what is being shown? And then the same with data collection and production. We split it up into the basic and advanced level, and try to really scaffold it in the way that students can either just follow our resources, and based on what we have provided and what we have explained, they can understand these methods and they can see differences in working with the data. Or in the advanced level data, maybe they can really do it themselves. They can assess and also maybe critically evaluate the processes that are going on. And so here we have the split again, and the same also for the aspects of data evaluation and also for data use. So this is the matrix that we've created based on a framework, and that we really try to sort of lean our learning resources on, so that we have these different levels of understanding, and hopefully in that way both bachelor students and master students, or depending on which level that you feel you are at, that there are different learning resources covering these different levels.
Right, and once we had these competencies defined, we could start to actually develop the learning resources that would teach our students these competencies. And as you can see, we developed a wide range of resources with different topics from all sections of the life cycle of a data project about machine translation. And we also provide them in different formats. We have classic papers to read. As you know, we also have videos on YouTube to watch, and Jupyter notebooks, which are basically a mix of explanatory text, but also executable Python code to learn more about the respective topics hands-on without necessarily having to be familiar with coding or NLP in general. And we started by providing simple topics like a conceptual overview, which establishes a data context for machine translation and refers to interesting resources outside DataLMT, such as Taos or Opus, for example. Then we talked about ethical questions that may come up when working with translation data and questions concerning social biases present in machine translation, as we heard before. And there we laid a specific focus on familiarizing students with gender bias and how to debias NT output or possible solutions for that. And then we have resources that focus on how to prepare training data for machine translation and how to train your very own NMT model, in fact. And these are really hands-on resources because they feature both Jupyter notebooks and video tutorials for these notebooks, which guide you through the whole process and really break down the individual steps of this process. And this block will be the focus of our first practical session by Ganisa this afternoon. And then we have also resources concerning terminology integration, which is a really dynamic field at the moment, as many MT providers such as DeepL or Systran, and even some casual providers such as Phrase or formerly MemSource, are regularly announcing new features to learn about. For example, we talk about which role terminology plays in training an NMT system or model, and about enforcing desired target terms in NMT output with glossary features. And probably the largest block of our project is the automatic MT quality evaluation, as you can see here in the screenshot, where we explain in detail different metrics such as the blur score, translation edit rate, bird score, and commit. But we not only explain the metrics themselves, but also the technology and method behind these metrics, which you can find in our companion notebooks on string matching-based metrics and embedding-based metrics. And this book is also one of our main focuses in the second practical session this afternoon. We also included a notebook on calculating metrics on document level, which is especially relevant for data-driven decision-making regarding economic MT literacy. For example, if you want to measure post-editing effort, or if you want to evaluate the output of your own models that you have trained. Talking about post-editing, we also developed a resource where students can pre- and post-edit different texts themselves by following specific guidelines and then create the translation edit rate to their text to see the effect of pre- and post-editing firsthand. And finally, we included resources where we compare German target text produced in different translation scenarios, namely machine translation, post-editing, and human translation, to see how they differ linguistically. And depending on the level, basic or advanced, we use simple or more complex tools and methods to analyze the target texts. And we'll be focusing on the concepts of machine translation needs and post-edities. And if you're interested in that, you can join our practical session this afternoon as well, because this will also a topic that will come up there. And most of these resources are already available on our website for you to try out, and a few more are being finalized at the moment and will be uploaded soon. And you're more than welcome to use these resources yourself or to change them to your liking or your specific use case.
Perfect. Exactly. So this is just one example of one such learning resource. So this is literally just one piece, so one screenshot of a long notebook that we will cover later on in the first practical session. So I won't go into too much detail here, but just so that you can see kind of how they look like. So this is an example of a Jupyter notebook of where we trained an NMT system ourselves, and then we created a translation. But this translation will be subworded. I will explain that concept later on as well. And then, of course, we have to desubword it so that it is a natural language. And this, for example, explains how this is done and guides you through the steps as well. So this is just to show that we always have some text where we explain what it is that we are doing, and we provide links to where there's relevant information. And then we have the code that usually can just be clicked and run, so without changing anything. And this is kind of how our Jupyter notebooks look like, a combination of text and code. But later on, we will look at these in more detail in our practical sessions.
Yeah, and the next steps, as I already mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we want to include artificial intelligence literacy in the mix, and we want to attempt to integrate not only MT literacy and data literacy, but also MT data and artificial intelligence literacy. AI literacy is a relatively new concept. To the best of my knowledge, it was introduced by Long Magaco in 2020, and they define it as a set of competencies that enables individuals to critically evaluate AI technologies, communicate and collaborate effectively with AI, and use AI as a tool online, at home, and in the workplace. And then we'll give some more information on AI literacy on the next slide. So they divide it into 5 components. What is artificial intelligence? What is the difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence? What is the difference between narrow and general artificial intelligence, etc.? What can AI do? The strengths and weaknesses of AI and the future potential of AI. For example, a lot of us tested ChatGPT and have a good picture of what ChatGPT can do and can't do. Now ChatGPT is obsolete already, and we have the GPT-4 models, which can do more things than GPT-5, etc. will come along. So this is a very dynamic field at the moment. And the question, what can AI do? The answer changes basically every minute these days. How does AI work? What is machine learning? How does it work? Neural networks, the important algorithms. Mostly it's transformer-based nowadays. What is the human role in AI? For example, the ChatGPT model, there's this alignment phase where you have this powerful model and then you align it to human values, in the sense that it cannot produce political propaganda, cannot tell you how to build bombs, etc. So this alignment phase where we align it to human values, this is a very important aspect where humans feature in AI development. Also, Long Magaco, they include data literacy as a sub-competence in their artificial intelligence literacy concept, which I think is reasonable. And it also means that if you have a good data literacy education, for example, in a machine translation literacy context, then you can quite easily take the next step and acquire artificial intelligence literacy, because also, as between MT and data literacy, there are a lot of interfaces or points of contact between data literacy and AI literacy. How should AI be used? This is the question of our time, maybe the question most relevant after how we fight climate change. How should AI be used in society? It includes the ethical dimension of AI literacy. This is something that societies will have to negotiate in the coming months and years. How do people perceive AI? For example, being aware that AI is not an autonomous actor, but there are certain programming or design decisions inherent in AI, and these will determine how these systems operate. For example, this alignment process, which I talked about before. And yeah, the final slide, we feel that there's urgency in developing AI literacy, data literacy, etc., both at professional levels and then as transversal skill sets at societal levels, because, I mean, the GPT-4 has been introduced. There's a recent paper by Microsoft Research, and they feel that there are sparks of artificial general intelligence in GPT-4. Up to this point, what we've seen were only narrow AI applications. For example, machine translation. They're very good at machine translation, but very bad at playing chess or whatever else you would want them to do. And we know that ChatGPT has been shown to be a jack of all trades, maybe master of none. There's a paper which is called this way. But you have this going from this very, very narrow AI focus on a specific field to this artificial general intelligence, which can perform a wide range of tasks, as we have seen with these GPT models. And they will impact society and different professional sectors in profound ways, we feel. So we're quite late, but we need to develop artificial intelligence literacy in our students, in society in general. Thanks for your attention. And Janisa, will you take the last couple of minutes to give a brief overview of our website?
Yes, I can do that. Let me just see. So if there are questions in the chat, then feel free to also speak out. But otherwise, I will show the website. Can you see the website?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. It's very different to Zoom. So, but anyway, so this is our Data Lit MT project website, and every other link, sort of every other relevant link, is also always available here on this website. So we have different sections. First of all, we have an introduction of about a project, and then we have the theoretical aspects explained as well, as we have just discussed in our talk. Where we talk about the frameworks, the professional MT framework, the data lit MT framework, and the mapping between the two. Then we also explain the competence matrix, as we have just discussed in our talk, that you can see here. I'll just skip to the back where we have some academic outcomes. If you're looking for some papers also that we cited in the presentation, you can find all the papers here. And then, most importantly, also, we have this one big nugget where we have all our learning resources. And here we explain sort of how they are set up. I mean, we've discussed this in this presentation as well, but here we explain sort of in what formats these learning resources can be found, and what maybe also relevant links that you would need to, that you could click on to learn more about those. We also provide the links, obviously, to our GitHub repository and our YouTube channels where relevant. I don't know, Ralph, if you want to jump in at any point.
Maybe just what we show here. I mean, we have a lot of code in our notebooks. They're set up so that you don't have to need to know what the code does. If you want to, we commented the code in the notebooks, but there's this nice feature of ChatGPT and related models where they have this coding capability, and they can also interpret code for you. So if there's some code where I think I would really like to know what this does or how this function works, which is shown you when I click on execute this code, then just paste it into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT to explain this code to you, and it does. And we feel that this is a really good example of intelligence augmentation, i.e. humans and machines working together to their advantage, so that you can leverage the powers of ChatGPT or future models to help you in contexts where you're less familiar, or you're less familiar with than other contexts. For example, having code interpreted or explained to you, or even if you encounter an error in the notebooks, we set them up so that they should work now, but we'll explain in the practical sessions that they're somewhat unstable. These online notebooks, conditions may change which we cannot influence, and then our code may not work anymore. It would have to be slightly adjusted, and we won't always be there to support you because we have limited resources for hosting and moderating this project in the future. So if you encounter an error, just paste it to ChatGPT and ask, hey, what's going on here? And in the best case, ChatGPT may help you to fix this code issue.
Yeah. No, perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah. And also just to show here on the left-hand side, you can directly click on each of the different learning resources, and they're all lined up in here. Also, just for information, we provided a little notebook here, also a collab notebook, where we introduce some coding concepts. So in case someone has not coded much yet, this is a notebook that is not part of our learning resources per se, as it doesn't cover a specific MT topic, but it does provide some basic concepts on Python programming in a Colab environment, in case you haven't seen this before. So you're very welcome to have a look at that short notebook as well. And then there are plenty of other resources here. And for example, in our first practical session, we will start with this resource here with MT training data preparation, and I will guide you through a notebook on collecting and preparing your data for NMT training, and then also training our own NMT system. Of course, we'll see how far we will get within that 1 hour, but this is also where we will start off in the first practical session after lunch. And then later on, we will also cover the topic of quality evaluation and machine translationese and post-editees. And everything that we will be using, you will be able to find on this website. So this is really how we have split everything up here. And we always provide the link to the notebook that you need, the link to the tutorial video, or link also to our GitHub if you need some more data or anything relevant. We always provide each and every link right here when we refer to one of these learning resources. So everything is really compiled on this webpage, and should really guide you through whatever it is that you need in order to sort of use the resources. So I would probably stop here. I'm not sure if there's any questions at the moment, or if there's anything also, Ralph or Andre, that you would like to add at this point.
I think I can already see 2 questions in the chat. I think we will stop here and take
Perfect.
the questions, and then we can ask, or we can discuss more in the practical sessions or in the wrap-up afterwards. Tamara, you asked, well, AI literacy, as long Magako understand it, they do not restrict this to text-based AI, but to AI in general. And of course, in a translation context, text-based AI may be more relevant. But then again, if you have multimodal systems such as GPT-4, which, if you're translating a technical documentation and have pictures of the apparatus that you're describing, then this model may be able to read or to interpret this picture and introduce visual information in its translation suggestions. So text-based AI will be most important for us, but also this interface to other modalities, as you have also in multimodal machine translation, where your MT system can attend to pictures, to videos, etc. So I think this will be the same for more universal AI systems, such as the GPT models. And Justus, you asked, I mean, we don't claim that we have a full curriculum, and if you work through this, then you're a data expert or something. We know that different universities, different institutes have different curricula. They have different degrees of translation technology introduced in their curricula. So we don't want to say you have to do this at this level, at BA level, at MA level in this class. So we basically designed these resources that you can take some of them, all of them, only one of them, and plug them into your course. For example, in Cologne, I have a master's course on machine translation right now. Some of the students may be here, and we'll be looking at some of the resources as we go through the different topics. We covered ethical dimension of MT, the technical dimension, etc. And of course, we developed these resources, and somewhat we had our own BA and MA programs in mind, and know which classes we have there and what level of competence we can presuppose with our students. But again, these are general resources you can plug and play as you see fit.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
Jensia, would you like to take this?
Yes, of course. Yes, exactly. Actually, Alina, the OpenMT training and also data preparation ones are based on Yasmin Muslim's preparation and explained in more detail. So in general, we are basing the NMT training also on the OpenNMT toolkit that I will also discuss this in more detail in the practical session, but exactly they're based on that, and then elaborated more and explained a little more, especially for an audience that maybe understands less of what is going on by just reading sort of a short text or a little code. So we really try to run through that in more detail, but it is these 2 resources are based on Yasmin Muslim's work as well.
Yeah, if I may add, Yasmin has been a very great moderator between the technical side of machine translation and its more applied side, or popularizing these sometimes difficult technical concepts for layperson or semi-professional audiences. And we give credit to her in our resources. We link to her GitHub repository. We do not follow her OpenMT tutorial, But our training and an NMT model notebook is based on OpenNMT, right, Janisa?
Yes.
On the transformer implementation of OpenNMT. But we use Yasmin's GitHub repository for NMT training data preparation. Yeah.